the agenda that we had sort of set out is to discuss sort of what are some of the key movers and stuff like that of why people are moving applications to the cloud, why they're engaging sort of, I'll call it an application modernization. Want to spend a lot of time talking about other people's sort of journeys. What was the impetus behind them doing this? What were the gains that they got from it? What were some of the challenges and things that they had? Want to talk a bit about, of course, sort of central logic and how we differentiate and how we help people, our sort of approach to this and modernization and stuff like that, and put out an offer to you guys to see whether there's an interest sort of to engage Scott and the great set of people behind him, to engage in a conversation with you to see whether there's a match or whether we can sort of help you guys on your journey. So with that, so why do business modernize, right? And you guys will be able to read this quicker, but I'm sort of going to go through it with some stories and stuff behind it. So the biggest thing of why we see people sort of kicking off a modernization journey or anything like that, a lot of times in sort of the impetus and moving to the cloud and stuff like that, is that there has to be a refresh cycle. Whether you're running things in your own data center, whether you're leveraging a shared facility, a sort of private cloud, if you want to call it, like Central Logic. For a lot of people, hardware basically sort of has a life cycle. And when you're at the point of needing to refresh that from an infrastructure standpoint or upgrade things, it's the right time for a lot of people to sort of look at it to say, is there a different way? Is there a better way? And by better or different, it might mean more cost effective, more secure. It might mean something that sort of helps meet with your business needs sort of along the way. We've had many clients, especially in this day and age, that are trying to expand their client base and basically their addressable market into different geographies. And historically, that is a pretty long process if you're running things in your own data center of finding sort of facilities, securing the hardware behind it, setting up that environment, network connecting, getting the apps up and running. This is a very sort of long and challenging process. So we've had a lot of ISV organizations that have moved to the cloud for the simple reason that it allows them to come up with more of a SaaS type model for a solution, and then they can differentiate themselves from the competitors and make it easier for their clients to leverage that. Very similar to SaaS offerings like how Microsoft came up with Office 365 or Dynamics 365 when people used to have to run that on their own. And with cloud technologies out there, especially if you're leveraging really good DevOps capabilities, you're able to replicate, rebuild, deploy into new regions and stuff like that quite quickly. And with the cloud providers out there, they do have data centers literally around the world. And if you're in government type areas, there's government versions that are much more private. And depending upon the countries that you work in, I know Germany specifically had some requirements around uniqueness of the data center that Microsoft offers there. And they did that as well. So, for people that need to expand their solutions and be running closer to where their clients are, because we still can't get away from physics. The closer the data is, the closer the application is to your end users, the higher performant it's going to be. And that's a big reason why we need to look at having representation or data centers or cloud presence in different countries. Optimizing costs. So this is always an interesting one because you hear a lot of the cloud providers talking about how much money you can save and stuff when you go to the cloud. And we'll talk about this a lot more later on. There are definitely savings and things to be had, but operating in the cloud is very different than operating on premise. It is a different set of tools. You really do need to adopt sort of the DevOps sort of mindset. And if you're moving like for like, right? So the terminology, and I didn't create a slide for it, I apologize, of IaaS, which is infrastructure as a service, or PaaS, platform as a service, or SaaS, software as a service, right? Software as a service, we aren't going to talk much about because those are canned applications. Great things if you're an ISV and you want to create a solution to basically get out there. But we'll talk more about IaaS and PaaS. So if it's infrastructure as a service, right? It's very much, things that are still running fairly 24/7. You have some capabilities to sort of shut things down or leveraging some technologies like containers and Kubernetes to expand and stuff on demand. But your costs are going to be less but not sort of quantifiable less. When you get into some of the PaaS services, if you aren't familiar with them, that can dramatically sort of change the game for you, because a lot of PaaS services that exist are very much on demand or pay by transaction. And we have some examples of how we modernize some of our clients when they were sort of up for a hardware refresh and the existing solution wasn't really meeting peak demand, and it was too expensive for sort of the low demand. New business opportunities, threats that require new features. So our applications, right, are constantly sort of changing, and the demands that the industry, that our competitors, more importantly our customers, sort of put on those require us to refresh applications, whether it's internal or external. But as we see, there's also new threats all the time, right? It's become so easy for people to try to target systems. I know where I live here in Canada, we had a whole bunch of hospitals basically that were taken down by some bad actors and basically by some ransomware attacks. And so these sort of threats and security is top of mind of every business, because it is far easier sort of for criminal activity if they can figure out how to break into one app, right? The model might work the same for others. And this is why it's so important for us, to leverage organizations or for your IT staff to be funded correctly, to constantly apply the patches, to constantly have a great sort of security footprint as you're looking at things, because these threats are real, and it can, challenge organizations. It can take down organizations. It can ruin your brand in so many different ways, right? So we have to be vigilant, right? When we look at our apps, if I have an application that was built 15 years ago and it has a bit of a customer facing entrance to it, I probably didn't know about half the SQL injection attacks that exist. If I'm using open source technology, which almost all applications do, and it helps applications accelerate, so there's no problem with that, but I need to stay on top of those components, those third-party pieces that I'm using, in order to determine if there are any security risks that have been identified recently about it, and patch those things appropriately and quickly. And there's lots of great things in software development tools, for scanning tools. I'm a big fan of sort of GitHub, and GitHub has some amazing sort of, their co-pilot for development, but as well as security tools that can automatically sort of scan the third-party packages you're using and coordinate sort of across the world with a lot of security centers and give you insight into whether there's any risks or challenges. So that to me is an important thing when we look at applications, and depending upon the business that you're in, sometimes people look at IT as a cost center, right? And the way I try to explain it to business people that have not spent the time in software development in this industry is, well, when you go out and buy your new car, right, or you have a house, you have to do maintenance on it, right? Things do get old, things do wear down over time, and there are better ways to do things, right? And you have to think about your software applications very much the same way. And security should be thought about first and in the middle of the day and at the end of the day. You want to reduce your technical debt and your risk of older applications. So I sort of talked about that a bit sort of in the threats and stuff like that. All applications have technical debt. If we look at applications that were first sort of built, you were building all the widgets for it. You built your calendar, you built your email sort of interface, you did all of these things. And if we look at newer applications, right, and newer programming languages and things that we develop against, a lot of these things are pre-built components. I'm a big fan of not just sort of, I'll call it classical development, but looking at sort of the rapid application things like Power Apps for Microsoft. And yes, I'm a bit Microsoft centric, maybe because I work there and we're aligned with them at a partner. But there's lots of different solutions out there. But these things have like 300 plus integrations with apps and everything else out there that can save you so much time. And more importantly, it puts the onus of upgrading these integrations with newer versions of third-party things you're integrating with on Microsoft or these other providers, which allows you, your company, your team to focus on what is really important to your business, which probably isn't the integrations per se, but it's the data and information you can leverage from those integrations. We work a lot with people in the financial service industry, and new regulations are coming out all the time. In fact, my wife is an actuary. For the people that know what that is, it means that she's really, really smart with math. And I keep telling her that if she just changed her title to be a data scientist or data engineer, she could probably, maybe double her salary from an actuary, because they're sort of doing the same things. So new regulations come out all the time, and we need to change process. We worked a lot with a lot of financial institutions in the early days, with Canadian sort of regulation boards and stuff like that, as it related to anti-money laundering. And so there was this thing called Know Your Client. And in fact, there was just one big bank that got in a bit of trouble for that here in Toronto recently. But when these regulations come in, it requires changes to your applications. It requires how you do things. The same way that when we look at the standards coming across from Europe right now about the information that you hold on clients and how the client basically has the right to basically say, forget this. These standards affect how we basically have to take care of customer information, the privacy around it, and our sort of change process behind that. And these things will affect old applications or new applications sort of equally, but it is a change to your application. The last one is a big thing that we see with a lot of people that sort of are looking at going to the cloud. In the early days, I spent a lot of time with companies working with them on embracing mobile applications, right? Cell phones and all the rest of this other fun stuff that we have. And, the thing I'd say to people all the time is the only thing worse than probably not having a mobile version of your solution where it makes sense for people that are sort of mobile and doing things is not having a strategy to update it regularly. As soon as mobile applications and things came on the market, it puts such pressure on most organizations for frequency of releases. I don't want a big waterfall release that we've planned for 6 months and took 2 years to develop and then released out. I want releases quarterly. I want releases even more frequent than that, because it allows us to adapt to the business challenges and opportunities sort of in the market, right? And so for a lot of organizations, DevOps is sort of the catch-all phrase. It refers to some tools like Azure DevOps, but really it's a thought process and approach to how we release and how coordinated this is between the various different parties that are needed. And so DevOps to me is such a fundamental thing, regardless of what you're doing with your applications, with your data, even with your infrastructure, because when you move to the cloud, everything is script and sort of software defined in that sense. So these are what we see as a lot of reasons why, organizations, and maybe you see yourself in some of these, are trying to modernize their applications or have an approach behind it. Sometimes it's difficult internally to sort of justify when we're re-architecting or rebuilding applications to the business because they think it might be good enough and they don't necessarily understand the risks, challenges, or opportunities that the people on this call see. Tyler, any other, I know I haven't given you a chance to speak yet.
No, it's
any other
fine.
thoughts
No.
or?
No, I always think of, the reasons why, because of all the trainings I do, we get a lot of people who come into these trainings that we put on and talking to them about, what it takes, the actual certain processes to actually, do these modernizations and things like that. And we're going through like the technical aspect of it. But Jeff, I love that you bring up the whole idea of like, the big proponent of DevOps, because really when, the reasons for migrating, what you really have to figure out is, it's very specific to your organization. What we see, there's no kind of one right path or anything like that, and it's as much it's about scaling to the technologies that are being used and the new technologies, and you worry about that with your your workforce. Will they be able to do it? But the truth is that they've always been doing it. So to me, that's always not the best reason. But what the whole process as well, Jeff, focusing on the DevOps, it's really the operations of the DevOps that I like to really talk about here with people in their organizations, talking about their end goals. How are they going about this internally with each other? It's like probably honestly the most important thing. Yes, learn the technologies, learn the services and all that, but obviously you're going to use them. But the processes that you need to put in place within your organizations are so important, and probably the most important thing in my mind. At the end of the day, you have to work together to make it happen. So putting those processes in from the very beginning, especially when you're taking this shift, are super important. So that's a big thing I'd like to add.
Awesome.
Yeah.
And I agree with you. DevOps is not a person and it's not a department. I just saw someone raise a hand. So in the interest of time, if you have questions or things like that, just send a message in on the chat, and Tyler and Scott will sort of be looking at those and either answering them or interrupting me. And if it is something that is sort of urgent you want to talk about, we can sort of bring up. So I just saw that one of the attendees basically raised his hand. If you can just send it in a quick text, Tyler will look at that, and if he needs to sort of stop me and we'll have a conversation around it, we'll absolutely do that.
Hey, Jeff, my name is Balu. I'm from Boeing, Cloud
Yes.
Solutions Architect. Some of these things you go into detail, correct, in the coming slides, or
Yeah,
like
so what we have is behind these, we'll talk a bit about sort of strategies and approaches and stuff like that,
Okay.
and how the technology can help with that.
Okay.
We only have an hour and we kept it a bit short, so we aren't going into architectures or things on this. This is really more sort of, call it a bit at a higher level, and we'll talk
Okay.
a bit about some of the customer. So if something is not being addressed in here, Balu, by all means, fire a text off. I try to basically allocate time at the end so we can get into some deeper conversations, or if need be, and you don't want to share it sort of with everyone on the call and stuff like that, we can set up a separate call basically with some experts going even a bit deeper on that.
Okay, sure. I'll shoot up my question in the chat. Thank
Awesome.
you.
Thanks. Okay. But there's a lot of challenges, right? So, for organizations and stuff like that, if you look across the board, I remembered sort of in the early parts sort of the pandemic, and it was just looking at job boards and stuff like that, and everyone was, in a frenzy, and the world was sort of changing. But a lot of organizations were trying to do digital transformations, enable, virtual sort of desktops because people were working from home or remotely. And so the problem is, the cloud native skill set, right, is still quite slim, right? There are handfuls of organizations, right, that are bringing this technology to you, Amazon, Google, Microsoft, and others that have a lot of people sort of deep in this. But there's not a lot sort of across the board. So we are still challenged with this. This is the reason why we see other development languages for people like Power Apps really taking off, because it requires some development, a lot of DevOps still. But then you can get some smart, technically minded BAs sort of doing some of those things. So a cloud native skill set is important. The other thing to realize is the pace of change is huge, right? And I'll talk a bit about that, in a bit. But the pace of change of new features being released, Azure functions, or when we look at the data set, we had SQL, and then we had SQL managed instance, and then we had Synapse, and now we've got Fabric from Microsoft, or Databricks could be an alternative. The pace of change of these things and trying to keep up with it is a bit overwhelming, right? And so it's great to be able to bring in a partner or people, right, that have been there, sort of done that, and transformed their own skills, transform their own sort of process. If you're still waterfall sort of centric and getting into a wagile or agile type approach, which a lot of organizations do as they start to sort of move to the cloud. Security is important. I said it before and I'll say it afterwards, right? Like, I always used to think of security as sort of a phase after you've done software development and just passed off to people. That's not the case anymore, right? We got to architect things with security in mind. We have to leverage the tools that are built into our automatic build process and everything else to check security at an individual level of components, at a system level, and then have things that are sort of monitoring for this stuff constantly afterwards. Conflicting priorities. I truly believe that everyone is being tasked to do more in less time, and that presents a lot of challenges as we have to deal with families and kids and everything else. And so the release cycle for most organizations is they want to get to a quicker release cycle, and for a lot of people the strain on that was also the testing. Is a lot of testing in most organizations still had a huge component of sort of manual testing, and we need to get into more automation testing cycles and stuff like that. And an interesting thing, just to sort of back up what Tyler was saying earlier, is when we think about DevOps, right? And DevOps, sort of from a name standpoint, for the people that aren't familiar with it, but you should be, because the name's been around for a while, was sort of development and operations synchronizing and getting together. And there's DevSecOps and there's NoOps. There's lots of sort of, I'll call it, flavors and philosophy sort of behind this. But I look at it this way, that if I have a good DevOps process, right, and I basically have a version control layer of my infrastructure, because that's what you can do in the cloud, because it's not physical to us. It's still physical to the cloud providers. But I'll have a version of the infrastructure. I'll have a version of my security layer on top of it. I'll have a version of networking that's all script defined. And then I'll have a version of my database, my data, my application. This allows me to actually test the release process because for every one deployment to production, I probably have 20 to 30 that are going on between dev test or more. So if I actually use the same process in dev test as I do in production, using the same tools to deploy, right, and deploying the infrastructure, I have no drift between these environments. And that is the thing that caused most organizations a lot of challenges. In the early day, I remember about, well, it works in my development environment, but it doesn't work in production. So I'm just going to tweak this script. And then all of a sudden, I can't recreate things. And it's a challenge for me. So faster release cycles is just a fact of life. I don't think the average organization will deploy as frequently as Netflix or Meta or any of those other ones. But I guarantee if you're honest with yourselves, right, the ask from the business is that you are doing many, many more releases, right? Typically with maybe a bit less sort of feature changes, but maybe higher value than you did 10 years ago. So I was reading something yesterday that was talking about 60% of the applications in the enterprise world still use COBOL or something like that. I was playing squash with a partner of mine, a bit of an older guy, and he was talking just about COBOL, and we were talking about sort of our histories with these things. So the thing is we have a lot of applications out there. And I know when I was a developer, being tasked with just putting a new feature in an application where it didn't have great automated testing and good documentation behind it, there was a great chance I could actually break more things in trying to put one feature in than the adding of the one feature, right? And so there's a challenge as we look at legacy applications that the brain trust between who architected it or documented it or anything else has moved on from the organization. And this is a big challenge for a lot of organizations. We've worked with some that were able to keep their, I'll call it monolithic application and stuff like that, but bolt on things like Azure Functions on the side to add new capability without the risk of basically changing this monolithic application that was, stable in its current state, but they were worried whether it would be unstable as they start to sort of poke at it. Reduced IT budget. So, we're all sort of strained a little bit. It's an interesting time sort of as I don't know if we can call it coming out of COVID or sort of living with COVID in that sense. And with the inflation rates going on around the world and sort of destabilization of economies and stuff like that. So IT budgets are always one of those things that we're being asked to do more with less. But we actually need to do more even with what we had from a security standpoint than we would have invested in a couple of years ago. So we need to think of different ways on how to solve these problems, whether it's reducing the cost of running the solution by moving to the cloud, by moving from IaaS to PaaS, or whether it's by greater automation, leveraging things like, Copilot and generative AI, which, is an interesting sort of topic, but there are definitely areas where it can allow stars to become superstars in what they do. We're leveraging DevOps so that I have better automation and less sort of risk and errors that are coming up. So when I look at application modernization and sort of the success and stuff behind it is anytime I change something, I want to look at it from the standpoint of that I'm doing it in a cost-effective way, that I have insight into things. Most people that move into the cloud for the first time and move quickly are always a bit shocked at some point in time with a bit of a sticker shock on a monthly bill. And that could be because someone provisioned a machine that was way bigger than what they needed, but if you provision it and it's running, then you've got to pay for it somehow. Or maybe they left things running when they shouldn't have, or they didn't accurately sort of assess what was this really going to cost in moving across? Or maybe they increased their security and increased their reliability and availability from 3 nines to 5 nines. But there's a cost to that. We want to operate things confidently, right? We want to have the knowledge and the insight. I remember when I first started playing around with some of the cloud stuff from Microsoft in the application area, and they had something called Application Insights. And I looked at this thing, and I remember Microsoft was having a heck of a time trying to sort of, who does it get positioned to? Is it the system administrators? Is it the developers? And it took them sort of a long time. But what Application Insights was, it's sort of like a free plugin, but it can give you insight into how your code is being used. You can basically build some things in with your application that when people are using this new feature that your company just committed $100,000 to developing and releasing, it'll actually tell you which of your clients are using it, with what frequency. It gives you insight into sort of that last mile of how things are being used. This was something that was absolutely incredible for a lot of people, specifically ISVs and stuff like that, to have that closed loop process to understand the value or why things weren't being used, right? So we want to be able to operate things confidently. And with a lot of the cloud capabilities and tooling and stuff out there, there's so many new ways to do this, right? Like APIs have become such a common thing for a lot of applications to expose either information or to partner with other people in the back end. And if you look at things like application API management, right? MuleSoft, a bunch of different sort of tools out there. This could allow you to monetize things in your application or to better integrate with other business groups or departments and stuff like that. But make sure that your top partner, your top client, your top most important whoever, right, is getting access to the API and the information and behind it in a prioritized, right, in a secure sort of way, right? So there are many great things here that can change the model of how we look at our applications and the business value we get from it, or we extend to the end customers. And innovate faster. DevOps, we've said it a couple times throughout this, right? But we need to innovate faster, right? It's, all organizations, right? I'll call it a bit with the exception of some government ones, as we deal with sort of municipalities and cities and stuff like that. At a top level in an organization, they're either trying to make more money or they're trying to spend less money, right? From a government sort of standpoint and stuff like that, they're trying to provide more effective ways of how they use the tax base and stuff like that, because they don't make money themselves, to provide services to the end customer, right? To provide services to me, right? Living in, Peel region in Ontario, living in Canada. And so we need to be able to innovate faster, right? And we saw a lot of this. COVID really pressed a lot of organizations from that standpoint of how quickly can we innovate? How quickly can we turn solutions around to enable our people? So when we look at applications, right, and we look at sort of ways, right, and I subscribe very much. Whoops, I've got to remove this window. I apologize for that. Causing a block there. When we look at things, right, when people are doing their cloud journey and stuff like that, a lot of times, there's a lot of great management consulting organizations that have like the 5 R's, right? Are we retiring things? Are we refactoring things? And this is sort of a version of that. So a lot of people, the first time they're looking at sort of their application, let's say their hardware needs a refresh, or they aren't happy with their data center provider, or they have new management coming in saying we've got to start this journey to the cloud. A lot of times what people call that is sort of lift and shift. And a lot of times, depending upon your application and what it actually uses underneath the covers, right? As long as it's not running on a version of Linux or Windows or the database that you're using, because all enterprise apps have a data repository behind it. As long as those are no longer sort of in support, as long as it's a relatively current version of operating system and stuff like that, most of the clouds, and I can speak more knowledgeably about Microsoft Azure, right? You're able to sort of just lift and shift. So effectively what you're doing is moving that server, not physically, right? And the application, the data to Azure. And sort of what that involves in many cases is, doing an understanding of, and there's a lot of tools to help with this, of, what does that application really need? How much CPU does it need? How much disk space does it need? Because in the old days, when we provided machines to run our applications on, it was very much a budgetary sort of restriction more than it was an exact science. The business would be optimistic about what they need to run, but the budget would only allow, and usually the budgets for this stuff was actually held by IT and not by the business. And it would be sort of a negotiation of, this is the best that I can basically get you. But when you actually analyze these applications, most applications, right, are not running at a steady state all the time. They have peak times in sort of demand and performance. If it's financial related, it could be month end, quarter end, year end sort of stuff. If it's other organizations, let's say pick on, the one Microsoft touted at the early days, when we look at Super Bowl and sports events and pizza consumption, you don't typically have enough horsepower and capacity for your peak right? And it's over provisioned for the average use case, which means there's a lot of money being left on the table. So when you move things up there, you want to look at these things to say, what is the right size for this? And if I'm not doing any changes to the application to sort of allow things to sort of scale up and down, right? How do I manage the cost? But if it's a pretty stable application and stuff like that, right? When you go into cloud and you go into Azure, you could leverage things like, if you're already a Microsoft customer, hybrid use benefits, or you could be going down the path of saying, I want to use a reserved instance. And that means you're committing to a certain size machine in the back end running in the cloud for a certain commitment, and then they give you a discount for that. But should you need to change that, it's sort of like breaking a lease for a car, right? There's a cost to it, right? So you want to make sure that when you move things up there, you understand sort of what steady state is, and then look at various cost options. For a lot of people, for every one production environment they might have for their application, they probably have 2 to 3, right? Dev, test, system integration environments. And Microsoft, for years, for people that have developed in that area, people have leveraged Visual Studio and this thing called MSDN, Microsoft Developer Network. And MSDN actually has benefits to organizations to give even lower cost for dev test environments. So there's all these different options that you have sort of when going up there, once you have the things up and running, on how to basically sort of manage the cost. But in the end, if I'm moving a traditional database up there or application up there, and I have these dev test environments that are running 24/7, right? I'm paying for basically the CPU cost in which that is running. So how we get more efficient there is we start leveraging things like DevOps, because we're scripting out this server that I need in the cloud. We're scripting out the deployment of the application. So if I have a test environment, or let's say a training lab that's only used a couple times a year, why am I paying to have that running the whole year when I know I'm going to have to update the OS and apply patches and everything else? Because that's just what we have to do in an IaaS world. Why don't I script this thing out? And if I know that it takes half an hour for it to deploy on demand, I can do that, right? That's the power of what DevOps does for your organization. Right? There were some smart people at Microsoft in the development that wrote this little agent that actually looked at, he had about a half-hour drive in from his house to the office, and his dev environment took about 10 minutes to sort of spin up. So he had a proximity locator that said, when I'm within 10 minutes of the office, spin it up for me. That was awesome. He came in and he had his environment basically running at the size that he needed at the time. But it also did the opposite. If I'm more than 10 minutes away, I probably forgot to turn things off. If we remember lights in office buildings, I remember when I was a young kid and I go downtown, I'm going, wow, these people are working really late. But really what it was, maybe there were cleaners there, but the lights were left on, right? And then we started getting smart. People would put up a sign saying, turn off the lights if you're not in the room. And then we implemented some technology solutions that would actually look for motion in the room. So if someone fell asleep in the room, maybe I want to turn off the lights. And we get more efficient that way. And you can do those things with clouds, and that's how you basically get better sort of cost effectiveness. Now, if I want to take these IaaS applications and stuff that I have, but I want to get a bit of this, cloud benefits, right? What we can get from PaaS, we can leverage things called containers. So the most popular sort of container strategy out there was something called Docker. And if I don't have time here, but great story of sort of why it's called Docker and why they have a ship sort of for it. That if you're interested, just hit me up outside of this, or send a text message, and we can talk about that. And then the solution to sort of manage all these containers and everything else, the most popular one out there is something called Kubernetes, right? And what Kubernetes did is, if I package up my application in this container, then I can quickly replicate this container to give me scalability, or I can reduce the number of containers that are running, and all of this is automated through Kubernetes to lower the cost. So Kubernetes was this sort of bridge gap, I'll call it, between IaaS, as I look at it, and PaaS, right? Of allowing me to start to get some of the scale up and scale down based upon my application and what it was, the needs of it. And that to me is sort of the ultimate utopia type environment. And we've worked with some clients that are very efficient, that are changing sort of, I'll call it, the underlying infrastructure for their application very often on demand to just get that much better sort of cost and performance for what they need. Refactoring. So I mentioned, about a monolithic app in the past that, it is a bit challenging and stuff to update. With that client, they needed to implement some new capabilities and features and stuff like that. So we were able to leverage some of these PaaS services, something called serverless, right? So, you know, in all cloud providers sort of have a version of this. I think AWS is called Lambda. And if you think of this serverless thing, it's sort of a misleading name because there's still servers in the back end running it. But effectively what you're doing is just packaging the little bit of code, the function that you have that you need to run. And depending upon what the trigger is behind it, it can implement tons of these things to run. Or if it's not running any of them, you aren't paying for anything. And that's what it means by serverless is I don't have a server sitting there waiting sort of for a request. This is an on-demand sort of execution. So if you aren't as familiar sort of with PaaS services across any of the clouds, right? These things are amazing. You can grab your web app, your ASP.NET, your standard sort of web app and the hosting container and stuff that you have and move that over to app services. And app services has built into it, right? Automatic scale features that you are basically just setting as options, right? Scale out, scale up, right? Denial of service attacks, all this other stuff that we used to have to code and think about, right? You might be able to just move your application over there to app service and have something that is much more performant and cost effective, and definitely less from an administration standpoint. You even have versions of SQL database for dev that are on demand. So the SQL database is not costing you anything, and the first call to it sort of warms it up, right? And then basically you're paying while it's sort of up and running. Cosmos DB, an amazing sort of distributed database solution that has triggers basically for instantly sort of replicating data across all of these different regions and zones. Incredibly cost effective and things you would not be able to get out of sort of standard database technology, right? If we looked at it from sort of 10, 15 years ago. API management solutions, serverless. So PaaS is one of these things that it changes the model and how we look at the costing or provisioning of things. Because for most things in PaaS, you're paying by a transaction. If I'm using API management connecting two systems. So if there's no transaction going on, I'm not paying for things. But it requires us to understand our sort of application and what we do with it. So in some cases, it might make sense to refactor, rewrite your application and leverage more of PaaS. We've been successful with a lot of people of just leveraging like PaaS databases with traditional code. Because you can basically have a separation in most applications between the data and the interaction to it in the application. So PaaS is one of those things that's absolutely amazing. And when you get to that state, your cost savings and your efficiency for your business is absolutely amazing. We were dealing with one organization that deals with sports teams, and what they leveraged is the business basically said, you know, if it's playoff season and our sports teams are in the playoffs, we have to have, you know, the ability to have many more clips, highlight reels, understand who's leveraging this on social media and stuff like that, you know, connecting into things because we can bring in more advertising dollar behind it. But traditionally in the business, they said, okay, here's the size of the server you have. Here's the size of your team you have to render these clips and to do things with it. And when they switched to more of a PaaS model, the business basically said, I'm willing to pay more because I know for every dollar I put in, I get $10 out. So let me scale that as much as the business needs and not be held a bit hostage sort of by the IT decisions that were made the year before. Rewriting applications, right? You know, it's never things that people always want to go to, but you need to look at sort of the security, where your business sort of solution is at, these new capabilities and what you might need to do. I'll also put in here rewrite. We saw a lot during COVID, people that needed to digitize, I'll call it sort of paper forms and automate process. And so we saw a huge sort of surgeons in people, and in one of the case studies we have is talking about the health regions and hospitals and stuff like that that went to totally digital online and being able to create within weeks basically a solution that allowed people to self-attest their COVID symptoms, or to gain access to a hospital, and they digitized the whole process, and that saves so much time and money, put safety into it. But now I have this data that I can actually action immediately, which is absolutely incredible. So you guys know your applications, you know your business, right? No one's going to know it better than you. But partners like CentralLogic, we get Azure, We've helped hundreds, if not thousands of organizations, right, on their journey to digitize, to move to the cloud, to look at their applications and their data models sort of in a different way. And if we put the best of minds from your organization with the best of minds from Central Logic, then I'm pretty sure that we can figure out a great path sort of forward to help you guys as you're looking at sort of your modernization.
Yeah, Jeff, and really to add to that as well, I think about here as far as thinking about like, utilizing cloud services and things like that, especially like for a PaaS service, you have to think about, as far as what is being essentially taken off your plate and it is handled now by, a provider like Microsoft for that example. And it's really bringing your developers are allowed to really focus more on actually developing. It's not managing anymore. It's kind of bringing back that, I always think of like, containers like microservices and things like that. The immediacy of code is like brought back to the forefront, allowing you to go ahead and not have to worry about as far as the technology and keeping up with that in in your current infrastructure, and being able to go ahead and develop while that infrastructure is being managed is a huge deal, and allows you to go to market quicker, allows you to be more agile, be more elastic as far as whatever it may be thrown your way. So that's just like that little bit I wanted to throw in there for you.
No, it is a different world, right? And it's important, I always say that, the consultants and stuff that I work with in Central Logic, they've been there, transformed themselves. They're all senior people. They've done the transformation on the technology and everything else. So a big part of this isn't just about helping you basically modernize an app and all that other stuff. It's about helping your organization, your people, and your process change, right? If you're moving towards agile, getting some agile coaches in there, bringing in the DevOps expertise to help you set up that foundation and what you want to do, and instilling the confidence in your people about this brave new world and stuff like that that you're getting into, so that you can maintain and extend any solutions that are put in place for you. So quickly on some customer solutions. Sorry, I talk a bit long sometimes. So AbleDent is one that was great. So they approached us and they had actually a security challenge. They provide sort of the back end dentist solutions for most of Canada and growing rapidly in the States. So if you're ever in your dentist office and you look behind the chair when your mouth is open and they're sticking implements in there, you might see AbleDent sort of in the top corner sort of the screen that the hygienist or the dentist is using. But they had a security issue. They had a software solution that gets deployed in the dentist office, but dentist office don't have IT professionals and security people and stuff like that. So, it was a pretty sort of open system in how this worked. They had to comply with sort of HIPAA and all of these safety or basically security and privacy standards in the medical area. And the best way to actually do their solution was actually move it to a SaaS-based offering. And we helped them implement DevOps. And they were really cool because as they were implementing new features and leveraging things, as I earlier said, like application insights and stuff like that, they could actually see which dentists were using new features and which ones weren't, which allowed their sales cycle and their closed loop process of ensuring that these features they invested in got used the best and were educated properly across the organization, grew the revenue and everything else, was absolutely amazing. Niagara Health is a network of hospitals and stuff like that we had the great opportunity to work with in the early days of COVID. And I mentioned for them, we'd done a lot of software development, helped them sort of move to the cloud and do sort of for other solutions that were moved up there, make sure that they were cost effective and running correctly. But this basically hit them hard, is they needed solutions quickly that were automating paper process, and more importantly, that was able to remove sort of the PII from this, but look at the data of the frequency of sort of people that had certain symptoms, or their vendors that were coming into the hospital, or patients or guests to the patients, so that information could basically be circulated real time. This tied into everything from Power BI and everything else that allowed them to action this data that they were getting through these smart forms, and to leverage this to basically make it safer for everyone and to make the hospital run better during a very, very challenging time. Finastra is a worldwide sort of fintech that we've had the opportunity to work with on a lot of sort of firsts and stuff like that with Cosmos DB and all this other stuff. But this was an example where they had a series of machines. I think it was about 15 or 16 that basically was becoming outdated. And the purpose of these machines and the application running on top of it was to do sort of mortgage applications and everything else. So it was a very sort of intense sort of process when it needed it. But what they found is that it was a very cyclic sort of timing, right? When they needed these things, the machines actually couldn't provide enough horsepower to do it in the timelines that they had. And then these things would sit idle, sometimes for months on end. So we came up in the early days when Microsoft had sort of had its PaaS solutions and functions and stuff like that. We came up with a very creative solution leveraging Azure Functions, which a lot of the first invocation of a function is actually quite free. But this function is just this little bit of code and it's triggered. So as mortgage applications got dropped into this folder, it would just spin up more and more functions basically exponentially to the point to be able to handle what that load was. And when there was no trigger or basically no work to be done, was an absolutely zero cost to them. I think this reduced the cost of this total solution by a 600 sort of percent and stuff like that, and gave them a solution which actually gave much better client performance, and therefore higher client sort of satisfaction with their solutions. It was just amazing when we looked at it how we could rethink that. And those were just three examples that I had, right? Like CentralLogic has worked with customers from all industries, sort of big and small. ObjectSharp, while it was sort of in Canada before, CentralLogic is a company that is across sort of North America and in Europe, with an office over in the UK. And like everyone has their own sort of story and journey as they're getting to the cloud and sort of what they're trying to do. And we love sort of partnering with people to sort of augment them, whether it's us being embedded in your team or whether it's us doing a bunch of heavy lifting and getting you guys sort of on that path, and then helping educate your team so that you guys can take it forward. So we've talked a lot about sort of serverless and development and everything else. I want to leave some time for questions, but I just wanted to give you a bit of a view, sort of CentralLogic all up. We've helped people from the very journey where they really didn't know what Azure was or what their subscription was, and helping them implement sort of the guardrails and landing zone, to really helping them understand their applications and bringing our insight and knowledge from the industries and years of experience with your insight into your applications and business and how your organization runs and the challenges that are there, to look at what is an amazing path forward for data or for applications, right, as you're taking on this journey. Now, sometimes it's, the decision might be, there's a great SaaS solution that sort of replaces this that would be better than actually doing custom software development. And we spend a lot of time with our customers looking at, what are these newer innovations and stuff like that you can take advantage of. For a lot of our customers, we do managed services for them as well, because they just aren't quite ready with their organization, or maybe the costing model doesn't make sense for them because they've got a bit of a smaller IT department. We'll actually do the managed services for them of these solutions or of the servers or data as a service and stuff like that, as they're getting ready for it, or in an ongoing basis, because it just makes more sense. So regardless of where you are sort of in the journey on this, my passion and the area I work with in CentralLogic is very sort of centered on application development, and I love the tooling behind it. I love sort of what this changes and does for people. I love sort of the potential behind like GitHub Copilot and changes going on there. And I can talk for hours about it and I'm passionate about it. But I wanted to give you sort of the perspective across the board, whether it's Oracle applications or whether it's, some of the older applications such as NetSuite or JD Edwards. We've got solutions in place and help our customers across the board, from sort of managed services to ongoing sort of extensions of those applications. Now, I'd be a bit remiss if I didn't talk a bit about sort of AI and generative capabilities and stuff like that. We've got a couple projects, I can't name the clients and stuff like that, where we're looking at sort of, call it intelligent chatbots, leveraging the OpenAI, which is sort of the backend model, if you want to call it, sort of behind ChatGPT, if you're familiar with that, that you can leverage sort of within Azure and tie in your private data in a very sort of secure fashion. And to me, it is a bit of the future of applications. When I think about chatbots and sort of how they came on, they were more sort of FAQ based and stuff like that. We can now do some incredible things by taking like call center data log and analyzing that to automatically come up with great answers. We're working with some organizations on modernizing HR from an internal standpoint to have a very intelligent process by which you can automate the creation of a lot of the forms they need to do, or answers going back to people on your benefits. And so when I think of this world of AI and the power sort of the data that your organization has, the data might need to be cleaned up so that it can be ingested in the first bit in a regular way. But it is a brave new world when we think about what we can add into applications to make them just that much better, that much more conversational in the way that people deal with them, to help our end users of those applications be more proficient, and therefore making our organizations that are providing it to them better positioned to win in the marketplace, right? Or to provide a safer or more reliable sort of answer, timely answers to people. So it's a pretty interesting time in this world as we look at application modernization and cloud adoption, and the the opportunities that we're all going to have. And partnering together, I think we can do some great things. So when we look at CentralLogic's sort of process and things behind this, right, is we really very much do embed deeply sort of with our clients, right? As I said earlier, you know your application, you know your challenges, and as we build trust with each other, we can be more open and honest about that. But it all starts sort of with an envisioning sort of workshop, right? To start to understand what's going on, and then getting into assessment and planning. And I'm sure you're reading these slides much quicker than I'm going to say them, right? And then we start to look at what is the proof of concept that we might want to do, right? Or is it a migrate, right? Because of time and sense of urgency or cost or things like that. And ultimately, how do we optimize and extend this, not just as a solution, but as the team that's going to carry this forward, providing, continued sort of success for the people that are using this. This all starts, right, with a complimentary sort of discovery call. Scott, my colleague on here, will interface with you if you're interested in that. And then discovery costs, we sort of keep sort of small and tight, right? We want to look at an understanding of where you're at. Like if you're brand new to cloud, you need a landing zone in which these applications are going to sort of reside, right? And those things can be done quite quickly, but we want to have that conversation to understand, your preference for tools, your expertise in certain areas. What are the demands on your applications from a security standpoint or availability standpoint, geographically, or sort of uptime SLA and all those other things, so that we can build the best foundation upon which this application can run. And a lot of these are educational sort of workshops where we sit with your team to help them understand, because it is really your decision. And we're just bringing years and years of expertise and deep sort of integration with Microsoft to help with that. Because of our deep relationship with Microsoft, we have these things called advanced specializations, which is only in the top 5 to 10% of customer or partners worldwide. It allows CentralLogic to be able to tap into some funding in some cases, where we can actually help offset the costs for these discoveries, or for migrations, or for modernization of applications that are targeting towards Microsoft Azure. So it puts CentralLogic in a very sort of unique position to be able to help you guys, not just with knowledge, with our experience, with our sort of top talent and stuff like that, but also potentially sort of at a bit of a cost sort of favor for you as you're moving forward with that. The way that the way that CentralLogic works is we're very much, we've got a lot of people. There's no one person that has knowledge of all DevOps and dev and all those other things. So we very much have, pods. We operate in an agile fashion, right? We have sprint zero to set things up. We bring the right person at the right time. Many of our consultants are accredited very highly across a lot of different sort of technologies, and that allows them to be very tight with the underlying sort of technology providers in the back end, so that we can get that insight and that help sort of to that organization when they need it from an expert that's been there and done that. So with this, I want to thank you very much for your time. I was able to do it 3 minutes under, or maybe 2 minutes under by my iPhone, which is pretty good for me. For the people that have been on my talks before, sometimes I talk a bit long. Scott, Tyler, are there any questions or other things that we want to open up? I still have a bit of time, so I can stay on a bit longer, but I do want to respect everyone's time that sort of showed up for this. And I hope that you found this valuable. And I think there's a poll and stuff that's going to be sent out It would be great if you can sort of fill that in and give feedback. It's the first time that I've done one of these sessions in a while, and I look so forward to hopefully engaging with you guys after the seminar, after the Christmas, Hanukkah break, and talking with you a bit about your challenges and your opportunities to see if there's a great partnering opportunity.
Yeah, Jeff, and I wanted to say, which is kind of, we open it up here for some questions at the end, but we also have, as you said, with the polls, we have questions for everybody as well, which I'm going to kind of throw those in, and you can answer them at your leisure in the chat here. But, you know, really just trying to get a better understanding of what brought you here and everything like that, because, you know, we are here to help you as far as wherever you are, as Jeff was saying, on your cloud journey. Central Logic can really, you know, take it from wherever you are and really help you to get to where you want to go. So, and help you really understand where you want to be as well, because that's a whole nother thing as well. Planning these initiatives within your own organization takes a lot of knowledge, and you know, and specialized partners like Central Logic. You know, you don't. I always equate it to, like, you know, if your toilet's not working, you know, you could fix it yourself, but you know, it's much easier to go ahead and hire someone to possibly, like a plumber, to help you out. So if you're new to the whole idea of, you know, migrating to the cloud or migrating applications, whatever it may be, you know, you call someone who actually, you know, knows how to fix the toilet, so to speak. Specializes in that. So we'll be throwing these polls out here. So I'll go ahead and, Scott, turn it over to you as well. Is there anything else you wanted to add?
I wanted to thank Jeff. I wanted to thank our attendees, but Jeff, that was fantastic. And I really hope that all of our attendees took something from this. This was really a substantial discussion. Jeff, you went into a tremendous amount of detail. I thought it was terrific. I will, as well as my Central Logic colleagues, some of those who already reached out to the attendees on the call today to provide you a direct invitation to join today. We'll be following up with you individually. You have my information here on the screen. For everyone else, obviously, I'll be reaching out to one-to-one. But yeah, looking forward to additional conversations. Happy to answer any questions that you might have. I see we're over 1 minute right now. So yeah, Jeff, I'm not sure if you have a hard stop, but it's probably best to just let folks get back to whatever they were working on. And I'll be following up and understanding any other questions that we aren't able to get to on today's call right now.
Yeah,
so
if there are any questions, I can hang around for a bit. I've got a client call in half an hour. And there were some great questions put in there just about people working in multi-cloud and stuff like that. And Microsoft actually sort of, I'll call it, leads a lot of the cloud vendors in providing things. So they have acquired solutions over time, one around Azure cost management. I don't know if there's a new name for it, that actually works across multi-clouds. Same with some of their monitoring tools and sort of security provisioning and stuff like that, work sort of multi-cloud. I think it probably works a bit better within the Microsoft Azure cloud, but there are a lot of great solutions to sort of help with that. Also, if you're working across multi-clouds, things like containerization and Kubernetes also allows you to do that. We did a great demo internally where we just had an application, as it was scaling, it could automatically just spin up basically different containers across all the three major clouds. I know there's more clouds than that, to basically service the request coming in. The client had no idea where things were being spun up. So there's a lot of creative ways and stuff like that. The only thing I'd say is it gets tough when you have a multi-cloud strategy, because ultimately, when you look at some of the more advanced AI data and PaaS features and stuff like that, they get a bit more sticky and specific to certain clouds. And so it's not just from a technology standpoint that you're going to have to create a lot of the underlying different infrastructure, like express routes, dedicated connections to the internet, right? In hubs and stuff like that with the cloud. There's extra cost to those, but it also puts a burden on your IT organization that there are fundamentally some things different when you're supporting sort of multi-platforms underneath. And then from a business standpoint, it makes it more difficult for them to determine which cloud should I go to for what, right? So you've got to be very good on sort of blueprints and prescriptive guidance and stuff like that when you're doing that. A lot of clients I worked with in the early days that wanted to be multi-cloud because they thought it was the least risk way to do things, very much sort of almost stopped themselves at infrastructure as a service and didn't go into PaaS, and therefore it would be difficult for them to get even better cost optimization and everything else. But if you want to have deeper conversations on that, we can do that sort of outside of this chat as well.